This is Bilal, your economics instructor, and today we are going to start off for the MCQs for the level O levels, and we'll start off with macroeconomics. Right? So this is a very important part of macroeconomics that we're going to be discussing today. It includes policies and taxation, because taxation is a part of fiscal policy, right? Supply side, demand side policies, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So let's get started, all right? The first MCQ, the government increases expenditure on infrastructure to stimulate an economy. What do you mean by stimulate an economy? To improve the output in the economy, or to create economic growth. In short, this means to increase aggregate demand. With which other government aims for an economy might this conflict? So when you're increasing aggregate demand, which other aims would it conflict with? So we have four aims: low and stable inflation, high output, and then we have economic growth, which is high output, lower unemployment, and balance of payment should be stable, which means import should be equal to export. So these are the four objectives. Let's look at the options. Decrease in income inequality. If it's decreasing, there is no conflict, right? We would want the income inequalities to decrease. Hence, this is not the answer. High rate of economic growth. So when the aggregate demand is increasing, there will be economic growth. Hence, there is no conflict. Had it been lower rate of economic growth, so there would have been a conflict, right? Lower level of unemployment. So whenever the aggregate demand is increasing, you can make a graph and you can check the real GDP would increase and unemployment would decrease, right? So unemployment is decreasing, there is no conflict between the government objectives. We want unemployment should be low, and it's saying it's low, so there is no conflict. A steady price level. All right, now in order to explain this concept, I will make a graph for aggregate demand and aggregate supply, so it's very easy for you to understand, right? So at this axis we have price level, at this axis we have real GDP, which is our output. So increasing government expenditure would increase the aggregate demand, AD1. Now we can see the real GDP is increasing, which means our economic growth is increasing, our unemployment is decreasing. Hence, there's no conflict. But we can also see that the price levels are increasing. Hence, higher inflation is the objective that would be conflicting. Right? So this MCQ would have been very easy if we made a graph. Right? So let's look at the second MCQ. In recent years, government have had to manage the effects of world recession. Which supply side policy would have been used to stimulate economic growth? So any policy that is supply side policy that is increasing your aggregate supply will lead to a higher economic growth. All right, let's look at the options. We have option A, increase in income taxes. This is incorrect because this is a demand side policy. Investment in skills and training. So usually the government, the examiner would include education and training. So that is one of the components that you people need to remember. That will always be the answer when there is supply side policy. We can look at other payment, other options. Payment of unemployment benefit, this is incorrect because this includes government spending, which is a part of demand side policy. Reduction in interest rate, this is basically monetary policy, so this is also incorrect. All right, so let's move on to the third MCQ. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started pretty quickly. Let's go on very quickly. All right, now let's see if you can get this one right. Which statement relating to supply side policy is correct? Okay, what is the aim of supply side policy? The aim is to increase aggregate demand. All right, this cannot be the answer. The aim is to increase long run capacity of the economy, which is correct. When we increase the aggregate supply, what happens is we are increasing the productive capacity of the economy. The economy which was able to produce 100 cars now is able to produce 120 cars. This would only happen when there is a supply side policy implemented. Reduce unemployment? No. This can be done with demand side policies as well. The aim is to work in the short run. No, this is incorrect as well. Supply side policies will always be in the longer run. Let's move on to the next MCQ. The table shows government's receipts from taxation. Right? What is the total amount of revenue raised by indirect taxes? Now, any tax that is indirect tax is on spending, not on income. All right. So we'll exclude those that are on income, and we will include only the taxes that are paid on expenses. When we are paying something, we pay those taxes. Right. Let's look at the options. Air passenger duty. Okay, this is an indirect tax because it's not on income. Tax on profits. Now this is a direct tax. I will exclude this. Import duty. We are buying imports and we are paying the duty. So this is your indirect tax. Income tax is on incomes, therefore it's direct tax. Inheritance tax is also what do you say, direct tax. Reason, because when you inherit there's an income, right? And when there is an income you have to pay taxes. So this is a direct tax. And then there is sales tax, which is indirect tax. So we just need to add these three items and then we get our answer, which is 375 and 385. So C is my right answer. So we need to be able to distinguish between direct and indirect taxes. This is how this MCQ will be solved, and such MCQs will be solved. Which statement about supply side policy is correct? All right. Which statement about supply side policy is correct? Any policy that increases the aggregate supply. That is the definition for supply side policy. The aim is to increase the productive potential of the economy. Now this, we have done a similar MCQ before, and the answer is to increase the productive capacity, which means if I'm making 100 cars, I need to be able to make 120 cars if supply side policies are being implemented. All right, moving on. Next MCQ. Tax is charged at 1.45% on all wages earned to pay for basic medical provision. How would this tax be described? Now, what this statement is trying to tell us is we are imposing a tax of 1.45 on the income. If we are imposing on the income, on the wages, this means it's direct. So either the answer is A or B. Now it is same, the percentage is same whether you are rich or you are poor. A person who's earning 1000 will also pay 1.45, or a person who's earning 2000 will also pay 1.45. Right? So this means that the tax is proportional in nature. Every person, whether rich or poor, would pay the same proportion in taxes. Hence A is the right answer. All right, let's move on to the seventh MCQ. What is not likely to be a conflict between government macroeconomic aims? Not likely to be a conflict. Okay, now just I'll give you an example. Whenever you're talking about inflation, inflation would always conflict with unemployment and economic growth. Right? So this is a rule that you people need to remember. Inflation would always conflict with unemployment and economic growth if aggregate demand is shifting. Okay, so let's look at the option. economic growth and balance of payment stability, will they conflict? All right. In the question, it's asking what is not likely to conflict. All right. So if there is economic growth, now you need to listen to this carefully. When there is economic growth, what happens is people are earning more. When people are earning more, what happens? They will buy imported goods. When they're buying imported goods, what happens? There will not be balance of payment stability. Hence, there will be a conflict between economic growth and balance of payment stability. A cannot be the answer. Full employment and low inflation. I just addressed this. Inflation and unemployment will always have a conflict. So, this cannot be the answer. And if you look at D, it's the same option. B and D are the same option. At one point, you're talking about full employment, and the other point, you're talking about low unemployment, which is opposite. Sorry, which is not opposite. It's basically the same thing. And at one point, you're talking about low inflation, and the other point, you're talking about stable prices. So it's basically the same thing, just asking in a different way. Right? Whenever there is full employment, everyone has money in their pockets, they're going to spend more. When they're going to spend more, what is going to happen? The prices of goods and services are going to increase. So B and D cannot be the answer. Hence, C is the right answer. Redistribution of income and full employment. Right? So whenever there is full employment, there will be redistribution of income. The poor people will be better off. Hence, there will be no conflict. Right? Therefore, C is the right answer. Moving on to the next MCQ, a government wishes to stimulate an economic recovery, which means we need to create economic growth. All right. Which means the economy, we need to create economic growth. All right. Which actions will assist this? Now, I'll just give you a rule of thumb, which is if you want economic recovery, you will either increase your aggregate demand or you would increase your aggregate supply. All right, let's look at the options. Decreasing government investments or government spending, so aggregate demand is decreasing, which is incorrect. Right, we need to increase aggregate demand. Decreasing income taxes, which means people will have more disposable incomes, consumer expenditure would increase and the aggregate demand would increase. Right, so B is the right answer. Increasing indirect taxation, so indirect taxation would lead to lower investments. As a result, the aggregate demand would decrease. We want option that would increase aggregate demand. Increasing interest rates, people would save, invest less, aggregate demand would fall. Hence, D is also not the correct answer. Moving on. A country is experiencing high economic growth caused by increase in consumer spending. What are the most likely effects on inflation and unemployment? So we need to make a graph, price level, real GDP. Now you might be thinking, how does Bilal know we need to make a graph? The answer is pretty simple. Whenever we are talking about the effects of shift in aggregate demand, we can make a graph to see what the effect would be. I could think of the answer mentally because I have so much knowledge and experience. But for the students who are doing it for the first time, it's better they make a graph so they are 100% accurate. All right, so this is aggregate demand, this is aggregate supply. Oops. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand, this is my price level and real GDP. Now, if my aggregate demand increases because of increase in consumer expenditure, the aggregate demand would increase Y1 P1. All right, so the price levels would increase, which means that inflation would increase and my unemployment would fall. So according to this, inflation rises, unemployment falls. So C is my right answer. Right? Let's move on to the next MCQ. 10. The government of a country Z announces a forecast budget deficit of 234 billion as part of its fiscal policy. Now, this is confusing when we are talking about budget deficits. This basically means that the aggregate demand is increasing. Why is it increasing? Because because the taxes are less and the government spending is greater. So we are spending, as a government, we are spending $234 billion more than the taxes we are earning, hence aggregate demand would increase. What is the effect of this forecast budget deficit likely to be? Now, it's just a forecast. So what's it is going to do? It's going to increase the aggregate demand. And we can see when the aggregate demand increases, unemployment would fall, inflation would increase, and economic growth will also increase. Let's look at the options. Economic growth would decrease. Now this is incorrect because economic growth would increase. Decrease in inflation, incorrect. Why? We see the graph above us and we see that the inflation is going to increase. An increase in employment. Now this is correct. Why is this correct? Because unemployment is going to fall and the employment is going to increase. Now you can see C and D, they're just opposites. They're the same thing. Oh, sorry, the opposites. Yes, the opposite. Increase in employment means fall in unemployment. Over here it's saying increase in unemployment, which is incorrect. Hence, C is the right answer. Moving on, 11. Low-income groups do not pay income tax but are able to use state-provided healthcare services. What does this illustrate? All right. Now, low-income groups do not pay taxes but are using healthcare provided by the government. Which policy or what concept is this? Is it a monetary policy? No, monetary policy includes money supply and interest rate, and there is no talk about money supply and interest rate. Is it privatization? No, because it's not saying that the hospitals are being privately owned, or it's just saying state provided, so this means the government is providing. Is it redistribution of income? Yes, that's the correct answer. Why? Because we are helping the poor people to save money and to improve their standard of living, so they don't need to spend on healthcare. Regressive taxes, incorrect. These are progressive taxes because I'm not paying any taxes, I'm poor. Progressive taxes. 12. The government uses monetary policy to reduce interest rates. What might be a consequence of this? So when you are reducing your interest rates, your aggregate demand would increase because your investments are increasing. So that is one concept, right? Now, whenever the aggregate demand increases, we made a graph earlier, inflation would increase, economic growth will increase, unemployment would fall. Let's look at the options. Inflation would decrease. No, this is incorrect because inflation would increase. Increase in the level of investment. Yes, I just spilled out the answer accidentally while describing this MCQ. Level of savings would increase. No, level of savings would decrease because of the lower reward. Increase in unemployment. No, unemployment would fall. 13. What is not a supply side policy measure? All right. What is not a supply side policy measure? A. Control of trade union power. When I control, as a government, I am controlling the trade union powers. This is a supply side policy because then I am able to correctly use my labor. I am able to reduce the powers of trade union. So this is a trade union. Trade union power, customizing it or controlling it is a supply side policy, right? Higher indirect taxation. Higher indirect taxation means Higher indirect taxation now is also a part of demand side and supply side policy. Why? Because when there are higher indirect taxes, people would invest less. When they invest less, what is going to happen? Businesses are going to close. Businesses are closing up, the country's production is going to decrease. The productive capacity is going to decrease. Hence, this is the right answer. It's not a supply side policy. It's basically a demand side policy. Privatization, because investments are leading to aggregate demand, right? So a higher indirect taxes is basically a demand side policy. It will have an effect on the production, but it is fiscal policy. Privatization, it is a supply side policy. And training for workers, we discussed this in the earlier MCQs. Education and training is always a supply side policy. So B is the right answer, because B is the only option that is a demand side policy. What is likely to happen when the rate of interest increases? Okay, now we discussed this earlier. When the rate of interest is increasing, we will invest less, right? So will the spending increase? The answer is no. Why? Because when the interest rates are high, people are going to save. So consumer spending is going to decrease. Firms buy fewer machines. Yes, they are going to invest less. This is the right answer. People will hold more cash. They are going to keep it in the bank. Savers earn lower rewards. Saver would earn more rewards. So pretty simple MCQ. We discussed this earlier. The opposite, we discussed when the rate of interest increases. Now the question is when the rate of interest decreases. Increases. And the other MCQ was rate of interest decreases. All right. What is example of government macroeconomic policy? Now, macroeconomic policy, money supply, it is a part of monetary policy, right? So this is a part of macroeconomic policy. Let's look at B, C, and D. Preventing price rise in the food industry. It's just one industry, hence this is micro. Had it been the entire country, so it would have been macro. Removing monopolies, barriers to entry, again one industry, micro. Setting a maximum price for wheat, one industry, again micro. Hence all of these are micro, and this is the only option that is macroeconomic. In trying to achieve one of its aims, a government may make it difficult to achieve another aim. What is an example of this conflict? Right. Now the question is pretty simple. Whenever there is a conflict, we need to think inflation would always conflict with unemployment and economic growth. Let's look at the options. Achieving a more even distribution of income may prevent rise in the average standard of living. Yes, when you are aiming for more even distribution of income, the standard of living will increase because everyone is getting more money. So hence there is no conflict over here. An increase in economic growth may prevent full employment. Incorrect. Whenever there is economic growth, there will be full employment, or we will be closer to full employment. Achieving full employment may prevent stable prices. This is right, because when we are moving towards full employment, people will have money in their pockets, they're going to spend more, inflation is going to increase, so we would not have stable prices. And D, stable prices may prevent current account surplus on the balance of payment. So whenever there is stable prices, lower inflation, that would that would create certainty, and the current account surplus would increase. It won't prevent it. Why? Because our products would be cheaper. So this is not the right answer. 17. A government cuts the rate of income tax. What is this likely to have on tax evasion and revenue from indirect taxes? Right. Tax evasion is legally avoiding taxes. Illegally. Tax evasion leads to penalties. All right. So let's look at the option. What effect is this likely to have on tax evasion and tax revenue from indirect taxes? All right. When I'm reducing the rate of income tax, so people are less likely to evade taxes because now they have to pay less taxes. Evasion would be there if I need to pay more taxes. I would be discouraged to pay taxes, and hence I would uh, evade taxes. So if I'm reducing the rate of taxes, there would be an evasion. The evasion would decrease. So A and B seems to be the right answer. Revenue from indirect taxes. Income taxes are reducing. It will have no impact on the indirect taxes because there is no change in indirect taxes. People that are spending will be spending the same amount. Okay, we can now, there will be a conflict. We can say that if people have more money, they're going to spend more, hence indirect taxes are going to increase. We don't need to look at from that perspective. We just need to look at from this perspective that the income taxes are reduced, so there'll be no impact on indirect taxes. So that's the only concept, right? All right, now 18. The information below refers to an economy for a financial year. The government expenditure 2866, government revenue 1940. What was the budget balance of the government in that year? Now we just need to find out the difference. The difference would be 926. Right. Now the revenue is less, so this means that this is a deficit. Had the revenue been greater, it would have been a surplus. All right. So 926 is the deficit. Now if we add both of these values, we would get the value 4806. We don't need to add, we need to subtract. One is an income, the other is an expenditure. Alright, now the most difficult MCQ. The diagram shows the impact of unit tax imposed by a government on a good. The original supply curve is S1 and the supply curve after the unit tax is S2. Right? What would be the amount of tax paid by the customers? Now, the initial equilibrium is 60. After the shift, the equilibrium is 70. The customer will be paying $10 per unit as a tax. How many units are being sold? 100. So 10 into 100 gives me 1000. So that would be the tax by the consumer, right? So let's just have a quick recap. I think I'm messing. All right, no, this is correct because now the other thing that we need to discuss is what would be the total tax, right? Total tax, customers plus producers. So as I have explained, the total tax would be the vertical distance between S1 and S2. So we can measure it like this, which is 50 and 70, so 20. And we are moving to S2. So the new equilibrium is at 70 at 100 units. So 20 into 100 gives me a total of 2000. So we don't need to multiply it by 120, we need to multiply it by 100. Why? Because the number of units that are being sold are 100, right? That is the confusing part. 2000 is the total tax, out of which 1000 are being paid by the customers and 1000 are being paid by the producers. Now that's it. Moving on to the last MCQ. An economy is represented by AD and AS diagrams, which is initially in macroeconomics equilibrium. So this is the equilibrium point, which change will definitely result in a rise in real output, right? So there are two ways. Either the aggregate demand is increasing, this would increase the real output, or the other is increase in aggregate supply. This will also increase the real output, right? Let's look at the options. Which will definitely increase the real output? Fall in personal taxation, aggregate demand would increase. Fall in government expenditure, aggregate demand would decrease. Hence, no effect on the aggregate demand. Rise in consumption, aggregate demand would increase. A rise in cost of production, the aggregate supply would fall, right? So we need to find out the answer where the aggregate supply is increasing or aggregate demand is increasing. So this cannot be the answer. A rise in export revenue and a fall in import expenditure. This means that the net export is increasing. Net export is increasing, which means the aggregate demand is increasing. When the aggregate demand is increasing, that's your right answer. A rise in the government expenditure and fall in the investment. Fall in the investment, aggregate demand is falling. Rise in government expenditure, aggregate demand is increasing. Hence, they were just counter set off. So that's it. I hope you got most of the MCQs correct. And if not, I hope you learned something. So ace your tests, your papers. Until next time, see you soon. Goodbye.